evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dan Cipher from the Association of Rice Alumni. So we're really happy to have such a large crowd here today. This is our third program in this Meet the Author series, and we're so fortunate to be partnering with the Friends of Fondren Library on this series. So without further ado, I want to introduce Harriet Latimer, who serves on our Association of Rice Alumni Board of Directors and is the chair of the Education Committee. Harriet?
Thank you, Dan. We are so pleased tonight to be able to have Kristian come and speak with us. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I really have the allergy and the laryngitis. But anyway, he has been at the Baker Institute for 2 years as our fellow on the Middle East, and then he also had been in London for quite a long time at Chatham House, and he is now here, and he has joined enthusiastically into the life of the campus, and he's leaving tomorrow, actually, to take 12 students to Qatar for about a 9-day period so that they can experience the Middle East in person. So he's a very wonderful, valued member of our campus and our faculty, and with no more said, let me introduce Kristian Ulrichsen.
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all to the Association of Rice Alumni and to the Friends of the Fondren Library for the very kind invitation to give this presentation based on the book that I published last year called The First World War in the Middle East, timed obviously to take into account the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War, the upsurge in popular interest in the campaign, but also at a time, and nowadays, in which many of the legacies of the war and of the immediate decisions taken after the war are being felt across the region. And so we can see that a century later, the First World War continues to cast a lone shadow across the Middle East and further afield. After all, 2 of the states that emerged from the legacy of the first large Western military intervention into the Middle East now lie in ruins. Iraq has been shattered by the baleful results of renewed Western intervention. 98 years after a British commander in 1917 assured the inhabitants of Baghdad, quote, "Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors, but as liberators." Note the similarity in language across the decades. Neighboring Syria has been torn apart by civil war as part of the post-2011 Arab uprisings that have really shaken the post-colonial system of states and regimes in the Middle East to their core. Indeed, commentators and analysts have referred to the Arab Spring as resembling a second Arab revolt, or alternatively, to heralding the final unraveling of the Sykes-Picot legacy. In each case, the terminology harkens back to developments during the First World War, as it was this conflict, more than anything else, that determined the nature of the Middle East that subsequently developed. Of course, there have been other much more recent forces, such as Arab nationalism, political Islam, revolutions, terrorism, civil wars, and not least decades of superpower rivalry and the Arab-Israeli dispute, that have all transformed the region and its place in international relations and international politics. The legacy of developments and decisions taken during World War I and its immediate aftermath remain a source of bitterness, contestation, conflicting interpretation to this day. Reflecting the fact that the war years represented a transition of the region from a crucible of competing empires to the emergence of states and of nationalisms, with national aspirations, the recasting of loyalties, and of course the birth of grievances that have come to occupy totemic positions in regional narratives. So my book explores the multiple conflicts that took place between August 1914 and November 1918 throughout the Middle East and North Africa. It examines the fighting that took place between the Russians and the Ottomans in the Caucasus, between the forces of the British Empire and France on the one hand, and the Ottomans in Gallipoli. Next month will be the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings, sure to be big news in Australia and New Zealand. And between British and Indian troops and the Ottomans in Palestine and Mesopotamia, what's now Iraq, as well as smaller outbreaks of fighting elsewhere in North Africa and in Central Asia. Campaigns in these diverse theatres continued for the entire duration of the war, and even outlasted by one day in Mesopotamia, the declaration of the armistice on November the 11th, 1918. Some of the battles have become immortalized in historical and national memory. Gallipoli is the most notable example. Other battles have mostly been forgotten, despite the terrible toll they exacted on participants and bystanders alike. One example is the Battle of Serikanis in the Caucasus of December 1914, in which nearly 1 in 2 of the Russian and Ottoman soldiers perished as tens of thousands froze to death in winter snowstorms at an altitude of 6,000 feet above sea level. Caught within the crosshairs of 4 empires, the Russians, the British, the Ottomans, and the French, vying for different aspects of regional supremacy, the Middle Eastern theatres of war therefore were characterized by vicious fighting in treacherous conditions along long and vulnerable lines of communication. The heavy logistical demands of sustaining an industrialized conflict, one of the first major modern wars, in the largely pre-industrial terrain of the Middle East, also made enormous demands of host societies and local communities. Greater still is the hardship caused by forced displacement and economic dislocation, resulting from the carving out of competing spheres of influence and control. Worst of all, arguably, was the Armenian genocide of 1915, in which up to 1 million Armenians were killed in an orgy of mass killings and death marches that continue to resonate to this day and continue to be highly politicized in their memory. Therefore, for the inhabitants of the Middle East, combatants and non-combatants alike, exposure to and participation in the war was intense. The hardships ranged from the rampant spread of disease to the forcible requisitioning of foodstuffs and natural disasters that could necessarily have been prevented. Their impacts meant that by 1918, much of the region was either in or close to a state of famine, as military requirements diverted scarce resources from civilian supplies. Areas of Syria and Lebanon were decimated by a succession of harvest failures and a plague of locusts in 1914-1915, compounded by exceptionally harsh Ottoman measures and heavy disruption to trading patterns. And up to 500,000 people died from the resulting famine that began in the cities and towns before spreading rapidly throughout rural areas of the Levant by 1916. Much of Mesopotamia and Egypt was also affected by food scarcities in 1917 and 1918, and remained dependent on emergency shipments of food from British-controlled India throughout the war. However, India itself was nearing a state of economic breakdown by the end of 1918 as well. Therefore, the relatively quick and unexpected end to the war in November 1918, the 100 days between August and November, saw the succession of British and French victories and American victories on the Western Front, couldn't come at a moment too soon for the Middle East, on the brink of collapse. Many of the English language works on the First World War treated the campaigns outside Europe as sideshows, draining much needed men and resources from the principal battlefields of the Western Front, where the war ultimately was won or lost. It was undeniably the case that the war was won in France and Flanders, and the fighting elsewhere did have at best a marginal impact on the final outcome. It was indeed the cascading collapse of the Central Powers in 1918 that led to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, as the Anglo-French breakthrough in Bulgaria that resulted from the collapse on the front in Macedonia and in Greece, directly opened the way to Istanbul in a manner that the British advances in Palestine and Mesopotamia, hundreds of miles away, could never do. But to dismiss the Middle Eastern theatre as peripheral to the conflict as a whole would do a gross disservice to the near total impact of the war on local society. More than 420,000 Ottoman soldiers died during the wartime campaigns in the Middle East, alongside an estimated 260,000 deaths suffered by the British Empire forces, a roughly similar number of Russian fatalities, and around 50,000 French dead. Non-lethal casualties from disease surpassed even these high figures. British and Indian forces in Iraq, for example, in Mesopotamia, recorded a total of 207,000 casualties from sickness in 1916 alone, compared to 23,000 casualties from enemy action, so a magnitude of almost 10 to 1. The the inhabitants of Turkey and the territories of the Ottoman Empire, the human cost of the war was even greater. Recent literature has suggested that the population of Turkey decreased by more than 20% in the decade of war that encompassed the 1912 Balkan War, the 1913 Balkan War, and then the wars of Turkish independence that lasted until 1922. This figure compared to the less than 1% decrease in the population of France, where most of the war's iconic Western Front battles took place. Thus, the centenary of World War I provides an opportunity to reflect on the enormity of the 4 years of conflict that profoundly shaped the course of the 20th century. And at a time of heightened interest in the effects of repeated Western military intervention in the region, there is renewed interest in how the often hasty and ad hoc decisions taken to meet wartime needs have left a complicated legacy that forms the parameters, the contextual parameters, through which much Western policy is filtered in the Arab and Islamic world. You have only to look at the images of ISIS declaring when they swept through Syria to parts of Iraq last summer that they were destroying the last remnants of Sykes-Picot, even though that historically was probably not true, to see the kind of the hold this has on the region. Such linkages were also clearly delineated in the upsurge of popular interest in the apparent similarities between the British invasion of Iraq in 1914 and the international invasion of 2003. In addition to the proclamation of liberation that I just mentioned in 1917, which could just have easily been uttered by President Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, or President Blair, attention also focused on the nature of the backlashes that greeted the attempts to force through these external state-building projects. I experienced it myself when conducting research for my doctorate, when numerous boxes of archival material dealing with British policy towards Mesopotamia in 1919-1920 were withdrawn from the National Archive in London in February 2005 for government use, much to the frustration of scholars whose access to historical materials that had been available since the 1960s was suddenly and severely restricted. In addition, a raft of historical memoirs that were written by veterans of the campaign in 1914 to 18 were then re-released to a modern audience after 2003, and one gained wide publicity in the United Kingdom when Sir Jeremy Greenstock, the British consul who was the counterpart of Paul Bremer in Iraq in 2003-2004, used one of those books to write an introduction that allowed him to vent his anger at the mismanagement of the post-2003 occupation of Iraq, because the UK Foreign Office had actually denied him clearance to write his own memoirs, so he kind of got around it in that way. So to put it into context, we have also to be aware of the historical background that shaped regional developments before 1914. Of course, the four empires, the Ottoman, British, Russian and French, but also in the ways in which local leaders and elites responded and adapted to the interventions in the Middle East. And there are two brief points to make before looking at the campaigns in the First World War in themselves. The first is the rapid rise of international consensus on the Middle East's commercial and strategic value to the international economy of the early 20th century. The struggle for influence in the Middle East straddled overlapping and competing influences for hegemony at the local, national, regional and international levels. Oil was discovered in Iran in 1908, for example, and massive oil reserves were widely presumed to exist in the areas around Mosul in northern Iraq. Longer-term continuities in the European linkages of settlement, trade and exchange also integrated the Middle East into a much larger and non-Western world. And during World War I, many of these linkages revived and solidified, particularly between the Middle East and India, albeit under British direction. And when looking at the war, India played an absolutely critical role in supplying the British campaigns in the Middle East, and in providing the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and non-combatant labourers for the armies in Palestine and Mesopotamia, which are very much joint British-Indian forces. The second major thread is the local agents of change have already populated the Middle East by 1914. Many of these agents of change are already prominent advocates of reform, contributing to a vibrant socio-political atmosphere throughout the region. Much scholarly opinion and public opinion is focused on Lawrence of Arabia, but there were many more personalities who made their mark in the region both before and during the war, including local participants such as the Emir of Kuwait, Mubarak the Great, who skillfully manipulated foreign rivalries and concerns to maximize his own position. Other prominent personalities spanned the political and intellectual horizons, contributing to a dynamic environment that was far from passive in the face of the imposition of external forms of control. And with the onset of the war in 1914, the trajectories of these local agents diverged widely. Some were eliminated under the cover of fighting. Nationalists in Lebanon and Syria had drawn upon the 19th century cultural and educational developments to create a vibrant literary and political landscape in the final decades of Ottoman rule. Many had participated in the first Arab Congress that met in Paris in June 1913 and adopted resolutions demanding greater autonomy within the Ottoman Empire, as well as making Arabic an official language in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. These nationalists formed the vanguard of a proto-nationalist, proto-Arab nationalist movement seeking to establish a greater Syria, what is today Syria and Lebanon. Following the discovery of their plans and documents confiscated from the French consulates in Beirut and Damascus, two large groups of activists were hanged in those cities in August 1915 and May 1916. And their deaths are commemorated to this day by a national holiday on the anniversary of the hangings, Martyrs' Day, and in the naming of martyrs' squares in each city. Other individuals and groups actively sought co-optation into wartime hierarchies, with a view either to bettering their own interests or building up political capital in return for greater self-rule and eventual autonomy after the war. Increasingly nationalistic platforms in Egypt and incipient national identities therefore developed as local officials, business people, private citizens, and the mass ranks of the dispossessed and landless reached their own accommodations with a much greater levels of external state intrusion into daily lives. And these disparate socio-economic groupings also reached very different conclusions on the meaning and the purpose of the war and the ways that participation could be turned to their advantage. Now I'll spend a few moments looking at each of the major campaigns before examining some of the broader underlying trends and themes arising from the study of World War I in the Middle East. Beginning with the Caucasus campaign and the struggle for supremacy in the Caucasus between the Russian and Ottoman empires, although not strictly part of what we might consider the Middle East, nevertheless is inseparable from any study of the war on the region as a whole, very much in the top right-hand corner of the map between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The fighting in the Caucasus constituted a major drain on Ottoman military resources during World War I, and therefore contributed to the grinding down of the Ottoman Empire's operational and manpower capabilities that had a knock-on impact on the wars against the British and the French in the Middle East. Indeed, it's been estimated that between November 1915 and February 1917, more than 3/4 of all Ottoman casualties were sustained in the Caucasus, leaving the Ottoman military machine much weakened when the British campaigns in Palestine and Mesopotamia increased in intensity in 1917 and 1918. The Caucasus campaigns also presented a clash of two empires that would not survive much beyond 1918. It was magnified by historical animosity and competing claims for territory that spanned the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. And both in St. Petersburg and in Istanbul, the imperial machinery mobilized and channeled immense resources to this renewal of the campaign against a familiar foe. Tragically, the ethnic and religious aspects of the Caucasus campaign also was a key factor in the sharpening of identity politics and the repression of minorities in both the Russian and Ottoman empires. As both empires were transnational in scope and contained substantial ethnic and religious minorities, the consequences of this politicization of identity were very severe. Moreover, the significance of the struggle between the Russian and Ottoman empires had consequences that transcended regional boundaries. It connected the fighting in the Balkans with the Middle East and the Caucasus, and encompassed such profound issues such as the appalling massacres constituting the Armenian genocide, and the competing Russian, British, French, and Ottoman visions for organization of a post-war Middle East. Toward the end of the war, with the Russian Empire in collapse, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and with the Ottoman Empire in retreat, newly found oil considerations came to the fore, especially in London. And these motivated an extraordinary campaign in view of the diversion of increasingly scarce military resources, in which British forces went all the way to Baku in Azerbaijan to try to take control of the oil-rich areas around the Caspian Sea in September 1918. Therefore, a campaign that began in 1914 as a contest for regional hegemony between two imperial powers and was characterized by battles that appeared initially to belong to a bygone era of campaigning in the 19th century, eventually, by the end of the war, came to anticipate the oil-based reconfiguration of geopolitical interest that marked the subsequent evolution of policy in much of the Caucasus throughout the 20th century. The other three campaigns in the Middle East were in Gallipoli, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, and all were British-led. The futile attempt to force the Straits of the Dardanelles and seize the Gallipoli Peninsula, the kind of choke point between what's now Greece and Turkey, the entrance to the Black Sea, was among the most evocative memories of the war that continues to stir passionate interest and debate a century later. Gallipoli, the campaign to force the Straits of the Dardanelles, as part of the drive toward Istanbul, played a decisive role in the subsequent development of national identity, not only in Australia and in New Zealand, which supplied many of the troops involved, but also in Turkey, where Mustafa Kemal gained legendary status and eventually became Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey in 1923. Pressure to open up a new front in the Mediterranean had been building since the Ottoman entry into the First World War in November 1914. The pressure was magnified by the stalemate on the Western Front, as the initial fluidity on the battlefield gave way to the lines of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Led by Winston Churchill, the combative First Lord of the Admiralty, pressure for a way of overcoming the bloody stasis and lengthening casualty lines on the Western Front increased. There was also a need to open up the Dardanelles to Russian shipping and to meet the Tsar regime's long-standing interest in the city of Istanbul, adding a potent Russian dimension to the campaign. Gallipoli therefore represented the intersection of Russian expansionist objectives in the Middle East, the intent to take Istanbul as the kind of seat of orthodoxy, with British attempts to construct a wartime alliance of convenience against the Ottoman Empire. However, the failure of the initial British and French warships to blast their way through the Strait of the Dardanelles 100 years ago last week necessitated an expansion of the campaign in March and April and multiple assaults on the Gallipoli Peninsula between April and August. These things took place in an extremely difficult terrain where you had beachheads, tiny narrow beachheads, isolated from one another, and the Turks in command, or the Ottomans in command of all the high country, the hill ground, that ran down the centre of the peninsula. And this was a photograph I took in 2007, standing from the uppermost section of the high ground. You can see down towards Suvla Bay, which is one of the main landing points in 1915. Attempting to take that high ground in the face of overwhelming enemy fire, you could be surrounded by three sides by enemy fire. There was one day, one evening, when New Zealand forces actually got to the top of the ridge, but they were unsupported, and for a few tantalizing hours they could see down to the rest of the peninsula, but then they were driven off the ridge by an Ottoman counterattack, and they never got anywhere close again to kind of seizing the strategic backbone of the peninsula that is kind of so vivid in that photograph. So, following the continuing failure to dislodge the Ottomans from the high ground, the decision eventually was taken to evacuate the campaign in December 1915 after a massive snowstorm led to hundreds of casualties from frostbite, people freezing to death in their hundreds on both sides, whereupon the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force returned to British control of Egypt. And in Egypt, it was the strategic importance of the Suez Canal to British imperial supply lines that required the immediate formalization of the de facto British occupation of the country that had begun in 1882. Previously, Egypt had been part of the Ottoman Empire. British and Indian troops therefore repelled an early Ottoman threat against the Suez Canal in February 1915, before pushing eastward to secure control over the Sinai Peninsula, as well as westward to gain control over the Western Desert along the Libyan border. With Egypt secured by mid-1916, British commanders then pushed into Ottoman Palestine, suffering two major military setbacks at Gaza, the First Battle of Gaza in March 1917, the Second Battle in April. The Second Battle of Gaza was notable for the first use of poison gas in warfare in the Middle East by British troops, arguably the first use of a chemical weapon in the Middle East, when British troops released gas canisters in an attempt to gain the initiative over the Ottomans. The attempt was a complete failure because in the heat the gas evaporated and nobody even knew that it had been used. After the two defeats in March and April 1917, there was a thorough reorganisation of the British and Indian force, which enabled General Allenby to break through the Ottoman front in November 1917 and advance rapidly to capture Jerusalem in December. Subsequent military operations in the final months of the war culminated in the hasty British occupation of Syria at the end of 1918, setting the seeds for a triangular British, French, Arab struggle for control that greatly embittered and complicated post-war ties. British and Indian forces also got tied down in large numbers in Mesopotamia, where a campaign that started with an assault on Basra in November 1914 only ended with the capture of Mosul 11 days after the Ottoman War came to an end in November 1918. The Mesopotamia campaign was one of great contrast, as a series of initial easy victories for British and Indian troops came to a shuddering halt with the surrender of their garrison at Kut in April 1916. And until the fall of Singapore in 1942, the surrender of Kut and the loss of 9,000 British and Indian troops was considered the greatest imperial humiliation yet suffered by the British Empire. And it triggered a damning governmental inquiry that, unlike the inquiry that's been taking place in London for the last 6 years for the 2003 invasion, has claimed, in 1917 it claimed 3 ministerial scalps. It was a really hard-hitting report and a complete kind of examination of all the factors that went wrong in Iraq and Mesopotamia. Another thorough organisation took place, paralleling that one taking place in Egypt at the same time. And again, there was an advance in 1917 when Baghdad was captured in March, 11th of March 1917. In addition to providing an example of Western intervention that was again emulated 3 times more in 1941, in 1991, and in 2003, the legacy of the campaign in Mesopotamia framed the way for the creation of the modern state of Iraq in 1921. Therefore represented a formative political historical development in modern Iraqi history, and the legacy of political decisions made during and immediately after World War I were instrumental in shaping the nature of the Iraqi polity that emerged, and the Iraqi backlash, the Al-Thawra al-Iraqiyya al-Kubra, the Great Iraqi Revolution of 1920, which took place when local communities banded together against British control in a kind of nationwide campaign to try and rid Iraq of British troops. And the historical overtones of that conflict became clear when one of the biggest Sunni resistance groups after 2003, in the insurgency that began in 2003 in Iraq, called themselves the 1920 Revolutionary Brigades, in conscious memory of the national rebellion that took place in the aftermath of the first British or kind of Western intervention and occupation after World War I. It's important also to emphasize in any study of the Middle East, as this photograph makes clear, the challenges of conducting highly complex military operations in an extremely forbidding local environment, including especially the ecological aspects of the war, which in many cases were not just ignored, but actually worked against. For the conduct of warfare in the Middle Eastern theatres was complicated by multiple challenges which defined the nature and the outcomes of fighting in ways much more powerful than elsewhere. Chief among them was the gap between the enormous demands of modern armies and the low levels of existing resources available to planners, military and civilian alike, meaning that in the initial stages of the campaigns, all stores and supplies had to be brought in as very little was available locally. It also meant an uneasy balance was needed to be struck between civilian and military demands for scarce resources, greatly magnifying the strain on logistical networks connecting military units to base often over lines of communication extending hundreds of miles. The relative paucity of roads and railways in the Middle East and the concentration of the Ottoman Empire's limited industrial resources in Istanbul, hundreds of kilometers away from the battlefronts, was another issue. And similar constraints faced the Russian and British armies operating far from their logistical bases, which in the case of the British were more than 1,500 miles away in India. Climate and ecology was also a critical role in determining the success or failure of operations in the Middle East, but they were regularly disregarded in the planning and execution of the campaigns, and their significance often has been overlooked in subsequent studies. I mentioned before the Battle of Sarakanis and the campaign of December 1914, which tens of thousands froze to death at 6,000 feet. But again, much of the fighting took place on these high upland plateaus at the middle of winter with no regard necessarily for any kind of the welfare of any aspect of military operations, taking into account the climate conditions. Topographically situated in the valley between two high mountain ranges, the zone of operations also was remote from road and railway communications, and temperatures plunging to minus 30 degrees centigrade, which is probably about the same in Fahrenheit. Large-scale fighting took place in late November 1914, continuing through to early January of 1915, during which period advancing Russian forces found 30,000 frozen bodies of Turkish forces. And the leading British military historian of World War I, Hugh Strachan, widely observes, quote, "It was the terrain and the weather and the failure to plan for these, not fighting the Russians, that broke the Turkish Third Army." Similar issues manifested themselves in different ways elsewhere. In the largely desert terrain of Mesopotamia and Sinai in Egypt, climate difficulties arose primarily from the extreme heat, not the cold, although freezing conditions was a major factor in the advance through the Judean hills in Palestine to Jerusalem in December 1917. In Mesopotamia, the advance of British and Imperial forces northward from Basra toward Baghdad began in April 1915 and continued through the summer heat. The problem being that not only was the heat at its most extreme, they were using the river, the Tigris and the Euphrates, as their main supply zones, and the rivers were at their lowest after the summer heat, which meant that many of the river craft simply could not function, and so they increased even more their reliance on extremely scarce animal transport to supply the forces. In Egypt also, the advance eastward from the Suez Canal across Sinai began again in June 1916, continuing through to September, again the hottest time of the year. And a letter written home by a British officer in the Camel Transport Corps vividly described the effects of a march undertaken during the heat of the day in Sinai in July 1916. Quote, "Nearly every Englishman and scores of natives got sunstroke and many died, both men and camels. It was a pitiful sight, poor devils fainting with thirst, heat and weariness, falling out or plodding on blindly." Climate and terrain therefore intersected on numerous occasions during the campaigns. And these placed important constraints on strategic, tactical and operational movements throughout 1915 and 1916 before they were belatedly gotten to grips with in 1917. There were also problems of flooding, spring flooding in Basra, that created significant problems when the British were trying to relieve the captured garrison at Kut in between January and April 1916. A British official stationed in Basra graphically captured the scale of the problem. The spring floods coming down after the melting of winter snows in the mountains of Turkey, where the Tigris and Euphrates originated, caused annual flooding in Basra, describing how the annual spring flood transformed the alluvial soil, quote, "into a particularly glutinous kind of mud, in which cars and carts stick fast, and horses and camels slide in every direction." And adverse weather played a direct role in the defeat of all three of the campaigns to relieve the garrison that had been cut between January and April 1916. For the urgency of the situation to relieve the garrison dictated that operations take place without regard for conditions. Therefore, the relief operations took place in the height of the spring floods when further hampered by heavy rain. Indeed, the final attempt in April 1916 to relieve Kut occurred in conditions in which water was clean across the front, 6 inches deep, with another 6 inches of mud underneath it. British forces made similar errors of judgment with regard to climate and ecology in Palestine in 1917 and 1918. The logistical and administrative reorganisation meant the advance northward from Gaza toward Jerusalem did not begin until 31st of October 1917. The late season meant that troops, their support personnel and their animal transport suffered greatly from freezing rain and winter conditions, some of the worst winter conditions for 100 years that year, as they passed through the hill country up toward Jerusalem. Appalling weather almost derailed the advance, as tracks and roads became impassable and many men and animals fell victim to exposure to frostbite. And the conditions were exacerbated by the fact that the soldiers and labourers had still their summer clothes, so lacked appropriate cover or winter clothing. There's a photograph of the Indian forces in the Suez Canal, and then the entry into Jerusalem of Alamein in December 1917. In the final section of my talk, I want to end by examining the political fallout from World War I in the Middle East and the ways in which the aftermath has shaped the outlines of the region that we've come to know. Beginning in 1917 and continuing until 1923, there was a struggle for political control of the new Middle East. How many times you've heard that phrase, the new Middle East? As old certainties disappeared and new possibilities opened up. In addition to bringing long-standing imperial and post-imperial rivalries to a head, the heart of the struggle was a complex and contradictory set of secret agreements made during the war that have been bitterly contested ever since. These include the pledge of British support for the Hashemite dynasty, the present-day rulers of Jordan, for the Arab revolt, while simultaneously backing rival Saudi backers in the Arabian Peninsula, so literally backing two competing Arab forces at the same time. Also the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 that carved out spheres of British and French influence across the Middle East, and of course the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, in which British Foreign Secretary Balfour declared his support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And it's a matter of historical interest that before the British decided on Palestine, they had previously been considering a Jewish national home in East Africa. So it was by no means inevitable among British officialdom that it would eventually end up in Palestine itself. At the same time, there was also British and French declarations of support for President Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination, especially as the expanding US role in the war in 1918 meant that British and French could no longer disregard American unease, the nakedly imperial ambitions that had hitherto been rampant, especially in the Middle East, as made in Wilson's 14 points of January 1918, culminating in the Anglo-French Declaration of November 1918 that really, at least on paper, renounced colonialism based on annexation and was an effort to try to align British and French policy with the principle of self-determination, at least again on paper. However, it emerged as officials in London sought to redefine their claims to a large swathe of the Middle East in a manner consistent with the prevailing wind in Washington as they saw it. As the First World War spun to an unexpectedly rapid end, with the breakthroughs on the Western Front between August and November 1918, 100 days, the contradictory paths of the wartime pronouncements and their promises inevitably rose to the surface. Another interest that came of age in 1918 went on to profoundly restructure the nature of the interaction between the Middle East and the international system over the course of the 20th century. And this was the growing awareness of the importance of oil as a fuel for powering the modern world, as well as for the geopolitical significance of controlling the world's known or potential oil reserves. The need for securing control over the Persian oil fields and the reserves thought to exist in Mesopotamia, even though actual discovery of oil was only in 1927, suddenly exploded onto the British government's agenda at the end of July 1918, so very late in the war. At that time, the British government recommended, quote, "We must at all costs retain our hold on the Persian and Mesopotamian oil fields. We must not allow the intrusion in any form of foreign interest, however disguised they may be." And it's a historical curiosity that one of the biggest objects of British suspicion was a Standard Oil company in the US. Oil and geopolitical interest therefore emerged as a core objective in the Middle East in 1918, at the very time that the sudden collapse of the Ottoman Empire opened up those new possibilities responsibilities both for Western intervention and for local control. Therefore, immediately after the end of World War I, between 1918 and 1922, the Middle East erupted in a series of backlashes against the wartime hardships and contradictory and often broken promises made over the previous 4 years. The ending of hostilities on the battlefields gave way to competing aspirations for the peace settlement among combatants and host populations, exhausted by 4 years of conflict. And the clash really was between British and French attempts to secure and to extend their wartime gains albeit in a less direct imperial manner, and surging national demands across the Arab world, especially once the Wilson's 14 points were made known in the Middle East despite heavy British censorship toward the end of 1918. The result was a sustained period of unrest that rocked the grand pretensions of the fading imperial powers in the Middle East between 1919 and 22, as local elites and local agendas emerged from the shadow of colonial control to powerfully exert themselves on decision-making processes across the region. Controversy over who would be represented at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 set the immediate tone, as it triggered a backlash among disaffected nationalists in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. The tensions in Syria soared between Arab nationalists who had taken control of Damascus and French officials who asserted their influence as per the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A series of sharp clashes between enraged coalitions of local groups and British and French forces laid bare the scale of the nationalist backlash against the Anglo-French attempt to reorganize the Middle East in their own interest. At the same time, the status quo became rapidly unsustainable there. We had revolutionary developments in Turkey, heralding the final demise of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Ataturk Mustafa Kemal. The creation of the League of Nations mandate system and the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne meant that by 1922, the lengthy period of uncertainty finally came to an uneasy end, and the outlines of the modern state system in the Middle East took shape. A few words then to conclude. Why is the study of World War I and the Middle East and its legacy important to understanding the Middle East today? It's no exaggeration to say that the war and its aftermath was pivotal to the creation of the modern Middle East. British forces entering Baghdad in March 1917, as I said, the first of many. The hastened demise of the Ottoman Empire and the war paved the way for the emergence of a state system, albeit under the League of Nations mandate rule, that remains largely in place today. The entire political landscape of the region was reshaped as the legacy of the war sapped the ability of the imperial outsiders to dominate and to influence events, as nationalist groups succeeded in mobilizing mass movements around distinctly national, not Ottoman, but national identities, national Egyptian identities, national Syrian identities, national Iraqi identities, so the creation of these nation states. Occurring, of course, as we've seen, as the oil became a permanent feature of a new set of Western geostrategic considerations as well, and the advent of large-scale mechanization during the war not only revolutionized the conduct of industrialized warfare, also injected that degree of urgency into the search for reliable and controllable sources of supply. Therefore, the Middle East in 1923 was totally unrecognizable from the Middle East of 1914. New political movements and mass ideologies were intermixed with emergent debates about the identities and development trajectories of nation states. And the focal point of decision-making shifted from the imperial level to the activity of national governments. A new political class across the region shaped against and tested the boundaries of the mandate system of the post-war settlement, while British and French colonial administrators struggled to adapt to new realities of diminished control. Turkey also changed beyond recognition, as Ataturk embarked upon a wide-ranging program of socio-political modernization that also involved reorienting the new Republic of Turkey away from the Middle East, turning its back on the Middle East, orienting towards Europe. In the Arabian Peninsula, the competition between the Saudi and Hashemite dynasties was resolved in favor of Abdulaziz al-Saud in 1925, with lasting consequences for the state of Saudi Arabia that took the family name in 1932. With the region in throes of renewed political turmoil, and having experienced degrees of regional and international crises, decades of regional and international crises since, many of them attributable, at least in part, to the legacy of those decisions, the complicated legacies of the war have more immediacy and relevance than they do in Europe, or indeed in Russia as well. A parallel can be drawn with the divided Europe up to 1989, where you saw the ramifications of World War II remaining highly visible across multiple generations. In this context, it's harder to establish historical distance from events whose legacy continues to resonate throughout the region. So much has occurred in the intervening century that while the connection to World War I may not immediately be made clear, issues such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement or the Balfour Declaration are spoken about as if they refer to contemporary controversies, as if they were made yesterday, so to speak. With the passing of the last surviving participants, World War I has moved from the fringes of personal experience into the history books. However, signs of the war are everywhere in the Middle East, or overlaid, of course, by subsequent conflicts and decades of bitter contestation. The legacies continue to reverberate long after they became historical memory in Europe. Trenches in Gallipoli, for example, if you just walk a couple of meters away from the main road, you'll come across the trench systems. Some of them are very well preserved for tourists, but even these ones, which are more kind of organic in the sense that they've been decaying over years, still visible everywhere. So Gallipoli, the shallow, in some cases reconstructed remains of wartime trench systems are still visible. So people who live on the road can walk a few meters into the pine forests. British war cemeteries also dot the landscape of the Middle East, some immaculately tended, and others in various states of disrepair. The Gaza War Cemetery, for example, was extensively damaged in January 2009 during the Israeli bombardment of Gaza in one of the many Israeli-Palestinian conflicts we've seen over recent years. And several of the headstones were damaged. And the British War Cemetery, the Northgate Cemetery in Baghdad, which contains the remains of more than 4,000 British, Indian, and Ottoman soldiers, including the captain of the city who made the proclamation at the beginning of my talk, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Ward, who was buried there, was damaged by a car bomb in 2009. Therefore, seen by many as sideshows to the main fighting on the Western Front, the Middle East campaigns had monumental consequences for the entire region. And as the region now stands on the cusp of another period of transformative, although highly uncertain change, in which many of those states that have been established after 1918 now appear fragile and brittle in some cases of Syria and Iraq, reshaped by events on the ground of which we have very little control. It's more important than ever before, I think, to understand the processes that exerted such an influence on the contemporary development of states and societies in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
We have 10 to 15 minutes for questions, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and Dr. Coates Ulrichsen will kind of point on folks.
If Russia hadn't been distracted by the 1917 revolution, is it likely they would have advanced further into Mesopotamia and Persia, and maybe down to the Gulf?
Well, it's a good question, because in Persia especially there was a long-standing Russian-British rivalry. And in fact, the British garrison at Kut that was besieged in 1916, the initial hope was that the Russian forces could actually come down from the Caucasus to try to save them. Once, of course, you had the revolution in February 1917, and the kind of distraction, as you say, of Russian attention, and the final collapse of the Russian position and withdrawal from the war at the end of the year, it opened up, in British eyes, an alarming vacuum in which the kind of the route to the Gulf was suddenly open for the Ottomans and for the Germans. So the kind of the emphasis shifted from concern about what Russia may or may not have done to what the Germans and Turks may be able to do to take advantage of that vacuum. And there was a level of paranoia and hysteria within British policymaking circles in 1918 of the supposed new threat. Because yes, if the Russians hadn't had the revolution, they could have assisted the British in, at least in kind of providing a strategic buffer, but at least they were on the same side. Once you had the Russian exit from the war, you had this large swathe of territory apparently laying open for an enemy advance. even though the Turks, the Ottomans, were arguably in even worse condition than the Russians had been, and were in no way to actually organize such an advance. British planners were absolutely paranoid of the possibility that that might happen, and that really laid the kind of foundation for the British advance to Baku, to Azerbaijan, to try and take over the oil fields before the Turks got there first. So the collapse of the Russians created an alarming situation, I think, for the British, and not least also because the Bolshevik government, after they took power, released the details of the secret British agreements, which had been kept secret up till then. And so suddenly you saw the duplicity of some of those agreements, the contradictory nature being made clear. And so you had nationalists across the Middle East taking and absorbing the news and factoring it into their decision making on whether or not to continue to throw their lot in with the British.
And the Ottomans managed to keep a lid on the travel problems that seem to be so prevalent in there.
Sorry? How did you
How did the Ottomans manage to keep a lid on the travel conflicts that are so prevalent today?
Well, the Ottoman system of control was based on, it's kind of very kind of decentralized in many ways. So you saw kind of sheikhs of many tribes who would be kind of the representative, almost a link between the tribal group and the kind of imperial power. And the British initially began to try to work through the tribes in much the same way. But the British fundamentally misunderstood the nature of many of the tribes. The British thought that they tried to import colonial practice from the northwest frontier of India, what is now Pakistan, where you had a very different set of socio-cultural and economic realities. And they tried to apply it kind of wholesale to Iraq. And so at least the Ottomans had been there for several hundred years, and they had this kind of organic system that developed, working through tribal intermediaries, and really almost confining the Ottoman presence to the major towns and cities. So if you were outside Basra or Baghdad, for example, in Iraq, there was almost no visible Ottoman control. Suddenly in 1915-16, with the British intervening to mobilize manpower, animal power, to requisition food and crops for the war effort, you had a very visible level of kind of imperial penetration that you never had before, and that was an extremely resented form of control that most tribes, most groups kind of saw for the very first time in Egypt as well as in Mesopotamia and elsewhere.
Was there the open hostility between the Sunnis and Shiites during this time like there is today, like it seems like today?
I mean, there's always a latent degree of kind of tension, but there wasn't the level of open hostility that we saw today. And especially in Iraq, the uprising in 1920 initially began as a kind of cross-cultural, kind of cross-sectarian movement. And actually you had kind of clerics in the major mosques meeting together to plan. And that was an extremely alarming development for the British, who, like in Egypt with the Copts and the Muslims in Egypt, had really tried to kind of divide and to rule, in a sense. And so the fact that you had national communities coming together, regardless of those kind of divisions, was an extremely new and alarming factor. What was interesting afterwards was that for various reasons the British worked to divide the movement in Iraq along sectarian lines. They worked increasingly with the Sunni notables to remind them that they benefited more from having access to power, in this case British power, than to throw in their lot with the Shia tribes who were much more socio-economically deprived. So the British succeeded in splitting the movement along sectarian lines. But what was interesting was that under Saddam Hussein, under Ba'ath rule, the memory of the 1920 revolution was reconfigured through decades of state kind of textbooks to make it seem as if it had been a kind of a Sunni rebellion, a kind of national rebellion led by the Sunnis, which is why you had in 2003 that Sunni insurgency group linking themselves to it by calling themselves the 1920 Revolutionary Brigades, even though the British at the time tried to actually divide it along sectarian lines. And the uprising ended up being an uprising of the Shia tribes, with the Sunnis choosing in the end to remain loyal to the British. So it's again the kind of politicization and distortion of historical memory, not just by us, but by Saddam Hussein over 35 years as well.
You mentioned Wilson and his 14 points. Prior to the discovery of oil, was there much American influence or interest in the region?
I mean, there was a degree of US missionary influence. What's now the American University of Beirut began as a kind of US missionary educational outreach in the 1860s. So there was US interest in, especially in kind of religious and educational fields. Also in agriculture, there were a number of US agriculturalists who were active in the Middle East. Many of whom then came to play leading roles during the war. They kind of remained in place, unlike the British, who had the British nationals who had to kind of, as enemy combatants, had to leave. So you had a kind of growing, small but growing American presence. What's noticeable is after the war in Iraq and in Syria and Palestine, there was a demand by some of the local nationalists that if there had to be an international mandate, it would be the Americans, because the Americans were seen as lacking that prior record, that kind of long and troublesome record of intervention the British and the French had. So you had two Americans, King and Crane, going to the Middle East in 1919 to kind of take soundings as to what the future of the Middle East should look like. And a lot of the kind of support in favour of there had to be a Western force, a kind of a Western intervention. A lot of it was that it should be an American one, because they were seen to be relatively neutral and lacking that historical baggage that the British and the French had, which I guess seems very interesting 100 years later, but at the time it was seen as very much untainted by prior involvement.
When I look at those pictures from 1917, 1914, it looks like you're in a time warp, like nothing happened for 2,000 years. And when you think of all the different civilizations like the Egyptian, Persian, how advanced they were, was it the Roman Empire that stifled all of that and just kind of dissipated up until, and then the Ottoman Empire took over the Roman Empire, so nothing changed for 2,000 years? It wasn't the Ottoman intervention?
I mean, there's a whole host of issues. I mean, there's a lot of imperial intervention, as you mentioned. I mean, think about the 12th, 13th centuries, Baghdad was one of the seats of learning, and especially the Dark Ages in Europe, kind of engineering and medicine really survived because a lot of the kind of Muslim invaders in Spain, for example, took back the manuscripts. So there's a lot of factors that kind of played into this. What was interesting among the British especially, British officials had all gone to Sunday school, they were much more religious than they are today, and kind of Christianity had a much more central role in British life. And the British looked at the Middle East in 1914-15, and they almost looked at it in biblical terms, as exactly you said, we can make the kind of region rekindle its biblical glory, even though the realities of life in 1915 were totally different from 2,000 years ago. But you look at the writings of some of the leading figures, both in London and on the ground, and they talk about the region in biblical terms, and it's incredible the kind of, in Iraq, for example, they were trying to introduce irrigation, and they couched it in terms of making the biblical Babylon come back to life. It's remarkable the discourse that they had, which really, I think, blinded themselves to a lot of the contemporary issues they were struggling with. They couldn't even provide kind of food to the local populations, and there they were talking about trying to restore Iraq to its biblical Babylonian glories. It's a complete mismatch.
We have time for one more question.
There's a question at the back.
What do you think the chances are that these political divisions made after the war in 1914, under the current circumstances with ISIS and other groups in the fight in Syria and Iraq, that will actually end up with a change in the political boundaries?
Well, I think the current fighting in Iraq with ISIS and Syria is the most profound threat to those boundaries we've seen. I mean, there have been so many wars in the Middle East over the 100 years since. They've almost all been interstate wars. And now we see ISIS as an incredibly vicious, to some extent powerful transnational actor, redrawing those boundaries. And again, as I said, recasting them in the narrative of destroying the Sykes-Picot legacies. They're trying to play to local audiences as well. One of the main themes of the Middle East over the last 20, 30 years, probably the last 30 years, has been the rise of non-state actors. think of Hezbollah, think of Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and of course now ISIS. And so you have these non-state actors which are testing the boundaries of that state system. At the moment, just as those states have kind of become fragile, brittle, in many cases authoritarian, with decades of leadership by leaders with varying levels of political or popular legitimacy. So I think, yes, ISIS and what may come is probably the biggest single threat to the state kind of system that emerged. And of course, in many cases in Iraq and Syria, that notion of a kind of separate state is totally dissolved. And so, yeah, we're seeing a state in flux again 100 years after it was really created.
Thank you, Dr. Ulrichsen. I am Debbie Crabtree, President of the Friends of Fondren Library Board of Directors. And on behalf of the Association of Rice Alumni and the Friends, we would like to thank you for your time and your expertise tonight. We have a small gift for you to save you from the opening process. We'll let you know there are a pair of bookends from our neighbor in the village, 10,000 Villages, which is a store that imports handmade international items from the world. So we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just have one announcement, and that is to please save the date and mark your calendar for October the 8th. This will be our fall series for the Meet the Authors event, and we will host Scott Dodson, who is a Rice grad, Lubbock College, 1996, and he will discuss his new book, The Legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Scott is currently the Harry and Lillian Hastings Research Chair and a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law. So we look forward to that. And now we'd like for you to join us out in the foyer. We have refreshments and a few more minutes with Dr. Ulrichsen.